Okay, folks, we're going to have our question and answer time now with Dr. McGrath. And what we want you to do is when you ask the question, this little microphone right here has to pick up on everything that's going on, and there's obviously a lot of background noise. It would help if you speak up. And so, you know, that relieves me of having to try to repeat what you said. And you can direct your questions to any of us, but I assume that you're going to want to speak mostly about what Dr. McGrath addressed tonight. So are there any questions that maybe occurred to you that you'd like to bring up? Don't all speak at once. Yeah.
How much of Lewis's writing do we have to credit to the horror of war? Because I imagine it seems to me he suffered greatly in the First War. And then in the living through those things, you know, I think it initially reinforces atheism, but it may be later on pointed to the depravity of humanity. But then he lived kind of on the outside in some respects through the Second World War, although there were bombs falling here as well. I wonder how much, am I on the right track, that affected much of his writing?
Well, thank you. I mean, the question really is how much did war impact on Lewis? And the answer is quite a lot, because clearly, as an atheist in the First World War, fighting in the British Army, Lewis was absolutely convinced that if there was a God, well, this shouldn't be happening. It's God's fault. And then in his more sober moments, thinking, well, actually, if there was no God, this war would still be happening. It's actually human beings that have made this war happen, and therefore I need to ask, what does this tell us about the nature of human beings, which is a rather difficult question. So Lewis, I think, found the war really very, very difficult to talk about and indeed to remember. And like so many people who've had experience of wartime conflict, I think Lewis found it easiest to forget it. You know, one of the most curious things about Lewis's reflections on the First World War is how few and far between they are. He just doesn't talk about them. And my guess is it's because it would have triggered a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder response. You enter back into this experience of war, and Lewis couldn't cope with that. And of course, Lewis was very worried he'd be called up during the Second World War because he was only a few months over the limit.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes, he was.
Yeah.
So he thought, I'm going to have to do this again. In the end, because he was slightly older, he ended up in the Home Guard, Dad's army, and he played a very major role defending Oxford Gasworks, which was hardly heroic. But I think, if I can put it like this, Lewis's own wartime experience really brought home to him how human nature is very, very ambivalent. In other words, there's this aspect of human existence which we don't really talk about very much, but very often it manifests itself in situations of extreme violence, whether individual or state-sponsored. I think Lewis saw war really as a rather stark reminder that you have to be able to account for why human beings do this kind of thing. I think that Lewis found that it was essential to have a realistic view of human nature, and that meant you had to find a place for the existence of war in your thinking about human nature. And Lewis felt Christianity did that in a very effective way, but he wasn't quite sure some of the rather naive forms of humanism that he knew did that very well.
Right.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
I was just wondering, when I'm reading the second of his science fiction trilogy,
yes,
Lewis talks about reality acquiring a different quality. So one of the quotes I'm thinking of is it's when the main character, Owen Ransom, arrives at Venus or Terralanda, and he says that the reality itself seems to take on so it was almost as if it was an eatable, breathable, drinkable gold. And if you resisted it, it would crush you, but if you gave way to it, it would permeate you and fill you with joy. Now, in the discarded images, I didn't see much of I wasn't able to come across the origins of that idea, but he's very keen on, particularly at the end of this discarded image, on paying tribute to writers and poets that had come before, and that was very much the medieval model. But in the medieval world, the writers wouldn't be seeking originality, but they would be paying tribute to those that have come before them.
That's right. He emphasises that point, yes.
I'm just wondering whether you've come across the origins of that idea in Perelandra, because I've not read why.
Right. Well, the answer is I personally haven't, but that's simply maybe the limits of my reading. But you're quite right. Lewis, you remember in The Scarlet Image, has this... oh, no, actually, no, I tell a lie. It's not The Scarlet Image. It's the earlier lecture, which is in his collection of essays on literature, where he says, in effect, that medieval culture is it's by bookish people who've lost a lot of the books they need to read, but they regard the books as having authority. And I think that is a very fair point. And in Perelandra, Lewis is almost asking us to imagine a world in which there is not a fall. And I think what Lewis is doing here is almost, if I put it like this, it's almost like a counterintuitive idea. It's a counterfactual idea. It's, if you like, trying to say, suppose this were the case. Lewis is very, very big on supposals. What would it look like? And what would happen if a visitor to that world was the one who introduced the fall? You know, it's a very complex and very engaging argument. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people find that to be one of his best writings. My own feeling is that it's an interesting book to read, mainly because of the image of the Great Dance, which I think is really, really interesting. But I'm not entirely persuaded by the argument I find there. But nevertheless, you can see how it fits in with what Lewis is talking about in The Scarlet Image. It's in effect about taking this way and making sense of the world. And maybe what Lewis is just saying, let's just push the envelope a bit and see what happens if we introduce this idea and what the difference that makes to the way we see things. So I'm not sure entirely how it fits into what was already there, but Lewis, I think, saw narrative as a very, very good way of opening up some theoretical questions which otherwise would be hopelessly abstract, and be able to offer a narrative solution. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question about apologetic method.
Go on.
The shift from modernity to postmodernity.
Yes.
And how C.S. Lewis, in a way, I see is coming out of modernity, being like the scientist in and how he's done a great job of showing the modern man the beauty of imagination, like you nicely laid out this evening. Now that we're, heading deeper and deeper into the postmodern age, who do you see as the person who's going to... I'm also kind of marrying in my mind the allegory of the cave, like the one who's come out of the cave, and he knows what it's like in there a little bit, so he can address that person with that kind of light or whatever they're working with to think. Do you see anyone in the postmodern age filling that role coming out that can address people? Will that same approach still work?
Well, I'm sure there are some very good people now who are engaging these questions. But actually, Lewis, I think, does give us the beginnings of an answer. I'm thinking of his 1945 lecture on Christian apologetics, where he says we need to know our audience. In other words, when we are engaging an audience, we need to know their language, in other words, to make sure we connect up with them and don't portray them as outsiders, but more importantly, to know where they're coming from. And what I find in Lewis is a range of approaches. And I think what Lewis is really saying is match the approach to where this person is and where they're coming from. So in effect, there are parts of Lewis's apologetic arguments which are very, very effective to a modern readership. And there are others which are very effective to a postmodern readership. And Lewis is asking us to know our audience and find ways of beginning to find the right way of engaging them, which meets where they are and moves them on to a better place. So I think that's a very important point that Lewis makes. But having said that, Lewis has this remarkable ability to engage both modern and postmodern audiences. But that doesn't mean that we can't be selective by which bits of him we use in addressing those two different audiences. For my money, Francis Schaeffer is a very modern writer and is very, very effective to a modern audience. But Lewis does give us the tools for engaging a postmodern audience. So here's what I think you could do. What I suggest you do is read Tim Keller, because Tim Keller, in effect, found Lewis wonderful, but in effect said Lewis is not going to work for my Manhattan audience. It's very secular, very postmodern. How on earth can I use Lewis? And in effect, he said, what I've got to do is use Lewis to people who seem to have a sort of attention deficit disorder. In other words, they can't cope with the length of time it takes Lewis to make his points. I've got to make them very, very briefly, but also show how the kind of things Lewis is saying connect up directly with existential issues. So I think what Tim Keller is doing is giving us a very good example of how you can take C.S. Lewis and use him to speak to an audience that Lewis didn't know personally. So I think it's interesting just to see that through.
So you've used the terms modern and postmodern. I'm familiar with those, but many of our listeners may be new to them. Can you define those two for us?
They're disputed terms, both of them, but I would say that the characteristics of a modern audience would be we're looking for reason and evidence. In other words, convince us. A postmodern audience would be skeptical about this, say, well, look, truth, really, that's just somebody trying to impose their ideas on me. Or this business about evidence, really, it's just a way of, in effect, justifying your will to dominate me. So a postmodern audience is rather more skeptical and wanting to look at perhaps a more personal type of engagement, a more enticing approach, which is all about showing me this could be relevant for me or enable me to flourish. So I think both those audiences are there. And what Lewis does is actually give us an approach which is both very evidence-based and argumentative. In other words, this makes sense, but also, and here is the difference that this makes, using narratives rather than arguments. So in effect, what you can do is be quite selective in the way you use Lewis. And my experience has been that when, in effect, you're talking to a postmodern audience who suddenly see things when they hear Lewis, they want to know about the reason and evidence side of things because they're now ready to receive that.
Nice. That's good. That's good. Other questions? You've heard the statement, there are no dumb questions. If you have something you want to ask, go ahead and ask.
Well, there are some dumb.
There are dumb. Yeah. So this is a standard.
About you asking.
This is a standard. Go ahead. Yep.
I've heard a lot of people talk about the trilemma being presented in the Christianity, being that is the best presentation. But I personally think the best presentation of that is in his essay, What to Make of Jesus Christ. What are your thoughts on that? Do you agree or disagree?
I can see why Lewis is making that point, because in some of his earlier writings he's clearly wrestling with that question. It's not that I don't find it persuasive, it's that some of the audiences I talk to don't find it persuasive. And what you have to do in doing apologetic is not say, here's a very good argument. You've got to say, now, how will my audience respond to this? Do I need to modify it? Because, in effect, there's a vulnerability there and they'll spot it. So what I need to do is find a different way of presenting it, or else say, here's a way of thinking that may take you part of the way, but not all of the way. So I'm just a little bit cautious there. But to me, that's an exceptional thing, because Lewis, I think, normally is very, very good. That seems to me to be a slight overstatement, which I forgive. But I just think it is an overstatement. But others would disagree with me.
So how do you read an audience? How do you know who you're talking to? Any thoughts?
You talk to them first. The good apologists will always listen before they speak, because they want to understand who this person is, where they're coming from, and in effect, once you get to know it, you can begin to say, I think I can say something helpful here.
Right. Oftentimes, people who are trained in personal evangelism get a kind of canned approach.
Yes.
And what I'm hearing you say is that maybe that's not the best approach, to have the canned approach.
Well, I remember once a conversation I had with Richard Dawkins. We did meet up for a very interesting conversation, and it was a private conversation, so I'm not going to say what we talked about, okay? But what I will do is tell you my impression. It was almost like talking to a tape recorder.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
I would make a point, And then it was almost as if Dawkins would press a button and out would come a pre-programmed response, which didn't answer my question, but was clearly the answer he wanted to give. So I thought, oh dear, are we talking to each other? Or are we shooting past each other?
Right.
And actually that is a very important point, because sometimes one of the points you hear secular audiences make is, I asked a good question, but he answered a different question. So it's just worth bearing in mind that point.
Yeah, we don't want to have a Christian version of the same thing.
No, we don't. No, I agree.
Right. Other thoughts? Questions?
We haven't mentioned it yet, but how do you see speaking outside of the Overton window, if you're familiar with what I mean by that as a method for apologetics?
Are you familiar with the Overton window?
I need to know what you mean by that.
Yeah, just that, just a little bit in response to what you just said about, waiting to see where somebody's at and kind of speaking to them on their terms, but sometimes an effective method is to say something that they particularly would find maybe a bit offensive, or maybe a bit just like they wouldn't expect it.
Yeah.
And that catches them off guard and knocks them off balance a bit, enough to then bridge some gaps and break down some preconceptions.
I think what I find to be most effective is to, in effect, talk of my own journey from atheism to Christianity and some of the questions I had to face along the way, because I know that the audience I'm talking to may well see those questions as being truths. And when I begin to say, now, my difficulty with this was this, you can very often see them thinking, I hadn't quite realized that. I mean, for example, to give you one, when I was thinking about this, I very often thought, I can't actually prove my atheism is right, but I accept it. And doesn't that really mean I've accepted it as a matter of faith? But if I've accepted that faith, why shouldn't I ask, is there a better faith to accept? And when I explain this to people, very often you can see them beginning to develop lines of thought which are uncomfortable for them, but I'm not pressing, I'm just planting a seed, you see what I'm saying? But I think that really what I would just say is that very often we don't understand who we're talking to, where they're coming from. So what you have to try and do is just say, well, maybe this might be helpful, knowing you're planting seeds that may grow in due course, or make them want to read somebody else, which is good, so they go and read C.S. Lewis or somebody, and that can be helpful in moving them on. But I think the real difficulty I have is that I see apologetics in very relational terms, which means I know something about the people I'm talking to, and sometimes you have to talk to people you know nothing about at all, and that can be difficult. Well, thank you for some wonderful questions. You've got one.
Yes.
Let's have it.
What are your spiritual disciplines? This is a personal question.
Yes.
What about C.S. Lewis? This is about you. We all grow in the Lord in different ways, and we all manifested our relationship with God in different elements in our own personal life. What are your disciplines? What are those things that you do, that you follow to grow in the Lord, to get to know Him more, to know that you are closer to Him? What are those things?
Well, I think the answer is through reading scripture and through reading some spiritual writers who very often will engage those specific questions. And I think that very often my own conversion to Christianity was quite intellectual, and so developing the emotional, the imaginative, the relational aspects of faith did take me some time, but I got there in the end. But you're quite right, these are things we need to reassure ourselves about. And very often one of the things I find quite helpful is to ask friends, how do you do this, or how does this affect you? And it's out of interest because it may well help me. It's in my own faith, but certainly will help me in talking to people outside the church, because I can then say, look, I know somebody who had this experience and this really worked out for them. Is that you? In other words, can this help you as well? So I think that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to talk to people, both believing and unbelieving, because it gives you an idea of the repertoire of approaches you can begin to adopt.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. McGrath. This has been a really very enjoyable evening for me, and I suspect for others as well. But thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful being here in this very atmospheric context.
All right, and thanks for coming out, folks. I mean, don't feel we're not in charge of this place. If you want to hang out until it closes, that's your business. But yeah, we're going to wrap some things up.
I've got to go, I'm afraid.
Oh, I understand. All right.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.